This is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, I'm Lynda Kinkade at the CNN Center. We have breaking news just into us. After nearly 2 decades of war, sources say U.S. President Joe Biden will announce a withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. It's meant to happen by September 11, which would mark 20 years since the World Trade Center terrorist attacks. Our Nick Paton Walsh is following the developments and joins us live from Kabul, where it is 8:30 p.m. right now. And Nick, the deadline was set for May 1 under the previous administration, now being pushed back to September 11. A new end in sight for America's longest war.
Certainly, but you have to remember that this deadline, what phenomenally symbolic as it is in terms of cutting short America necessarily being here for longer than 20 years, it comes with a lot of caveats. It is being announced right in the middle of intense discussions between the Taliban, the US government and the Afghan government, something strongly expedited under President Donald Trump, who simply wanted to get out, it seemed, as fast as possible. And now with a new impetus, with the Biden administration focusing on talks that they wanted to have in Istanbul starting this weekend that now look like they're going to happen the weekend after next. Quite possibly, this announcement giving the Taliban what they wanted, but at a slightly later date than they had previously been promised, is a bid to try and increase their interest in going to Istanbul. Just last night, they said that that was not something they were yet ready to do, and it may well be that this announcement heralds something which draws them towards the negotiating table. Now, bear in mind, this is not just about a peace process. It's about what's been America's longest war, frankly, in which over 2,000 have died, 20,000 have been injured, billions have been spent. A war which has vacillated between rhetoric of extraordinary success when the US troops surged in here under President Barack Obama, initiated, of course, after 9/11 to hunt down the founder of Al-Qaeda. He later turned out to be in Pakistan, Osama bin Laden, but a war that's constantly struggled to make its presence felt upon the insurgency of the Taliban here, that's increasingly fractured, and an Afghan government that's often fallen short in the eyes of its Western critics in coalescing around the objective of becoming less corrupt and able to govern the country so the Western forces could leave. They are still here, American troops, but in such a reduced number to the over 100,000 we saw at the peak of the surge. Now something in the region of 2,500, although there could be 1,000 more at times, depending on the rotations, and mostly confined. We're seeing today in Kabul how you simply see them in helicopters passing above you. Very rarely anything seen on the streets at all. Very few pictures, frankly, seen of their interactions with Afghans at this time, all part of a coherent message, possibly, to try and make their presence here invisible. After September the 11th, in theory, they should not be here at all. There will, of course, be questions asked about what deals are done with the Taliban and what remains of the Afghan government under any future peace deal, so the American can continue its missions here against the terrorists that it knows or it fears are still hiding within certain parts of Afghanistan. But it's also important to remember here too that this peace deal is not a done deal in the slightest, and there is a very key divergence now on the main steps ahead. The US has been pushing a peace plan which essentially says there'll be a transitional government pretty quickly. They'll try and sort out an arrangement with the Taliban and the Afghan government, and then there'll be elections. The Afghan government is saying, well, we need elections first. We'd much rather see the people have their say, and then when the president is chosen, we can then start going through the latter parts of a peace deal. The Taliban have been against elections from the start, so these consistent dueling ideas have essentially got many concerned we could see that peace process erode. But for the second time now, the US has made it utterly clear it wants to leave. It did it with the May the 1st deadline, this matter of days away last year. Many, I think, possibly thought that may end up slipping if the Trump presidency didn't get its second term. But it's quite clear now that President Joe Biden, a man who, frankly, since the Obama administration days when he was vice president, was always on the record briefing clearly that he didn't think a lengthy, sustained American presence in Afghanistan was a good idea, that his administration are now making it clear They think it's time to leave by the end of this year. But I have to say, this announcement does come with the caveats of we haven't yet heard precisely the details of what they expect the Taliban to do for their part of the bargain in order for that full withdrawal to occur. And then we have the months ahead now of peace negotiations, what could go wrong here in Afghanistan, what possible signs of extremism in the ranks of the insurgency here might emerge again, and what, frankly, fates might throw at this lengthy war to simply disrupt that process. But it is a startling, simple statement to hear from such a seasoned politician and student of foreign affairs as the Commander-in-Chief, President Joe Biden. He knows what he's talking about, certainly. He knows what's been happening here for decades. And so the stark suggestion that America is going home is one that will resonate in the minds of so many who've seen loved ones lost here or injured here, so many who've served here, given parts of their lives, given marriages, given their best years to fight this war. And the question, of course, will now be amongst so many, what precisely do they leave behind in Afghanistan if indeed the last American is out by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks that brought them here in the first place? Lynda?
Nick Paton Walsh, good to have you across all of this developing story. I want you to stand by for us. I will come back to you. I want to bring in Oren Libermann, who is our Pentagon reporter. He joins us on the phone from outside Washington. And Oren, Biden is the fourth U.S. president to deal with this dilemma that is Afghanistan. What is the Biden administration hoping to achieve in the next few months, given they've pushed back the withdrawal date from May to September 11, a date of huge significance?
Well, President Joe Biden has made it abundantly clear, not only recently since he's become the president, but also in his decades of work in Washington, D.C., that he didn't favor the troop surge of President Barack Obama. He didn't favor a growing U.S. troop presence. He made it clear he wanted U.S. troops out, but he'd also made it clear that the May 1st deadline set by the agreement reached between the Trump administration and the Taliban simply was very difficult to reach for logistical reasons and for many other reasons. But crucially, he made it clear that withdrawal was his goal. The key question was, what date would it be? We'd heard a 6-month withdrawal or a 6-month delay to that withdrawal, which would have been sometime in November. And now we have a much clearer date and, of course, a much more symbolic date, that of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which was the original reason for the U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan to begin with. It buys the U.S. some time. It buys the U.S. just under 4.5 months to get troops out of Afghanistan, about 2,500 troops, as well as whatever unknown troops there are there, which might include special forces and others. And that will be time to figure out how to get those last troops out of Afghanistan in some sort of way that is logistically possible, in some sort of way that is safe, in a way that can be done in coordination with NATO allies and with the Afghan government. From all accounts, Biden himself was torn on this, knowing that a full withdrawal from Afghanistan could lead to a collapse of the Afghan government, a takeover by the Taliban, and what would then or could then become a staging ground for attacks not only against U.S. and NATO forces, but against the U.S. itself. Against that was Biden's simple desire to get out of Afghanistan, that this was the longest war, 2 decades of war that hadn't led to any sort of resolution or conflict resolution or some way that could be called an all-encompassing peace. And there was no clear way forward on that, no way to get to some sort of perfect outcome. That was what made this such a difficult decision for not only President Joe Biden, but for his entire team and for the interagency that went over how to do this over and over and over again. Ultimately, the decision was the commander-in-chief's. It was Biden's. That doesn't mean it was a simple decision, and the conversations were ongoing, as we understand it, very late into this process as Biden tried to figure out how to handle this. Biden himself making that final decision, and now it's up to Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Tony Blinken to work with NATO allies. They're both there in Europe now, meeting with them over the next couple of days, and then coming back to move this process forward, a gradual withdrawal, which is to a very large extent what was expected on our end, that is, on the Pentagon end. And now it's how to make that happen, to make it work by the 20th anniversary, again, some 4.5 months past the deadline set by the agreement signed early last year in Doha.
Thanks to you, Oren, on the story for us. I want to recap what we're just hearing, this breaking news that we are hearing that the President of the United States, Joe Biden, will withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11 of this year. Nick Paton Walsh is in Kabul, where it's just after 8:30 p.m. And Nick, there have been obviously many setbacks to try to broker a peace deal in Afghanistan, including the US-backed summit, which was meant to happen in Turkey later this week, but the Taliban backed out. Where do things stand with the Taliban?
Yeah, I mean, the Taliban have said they weren't ready yet to attend that summit that was supposed to start on Saturday. It's not clear if this announcement is the carrot they need to get them to the table. I would suggest it probably is, because the open-ended nature of the Biden position, well, we're not going to leave by May the 1st because we physically can't, but we will do soon, was probably not clear enough for them. It may prevent what many were fearing here, that the Taliban would simply throw their hands in the air and say, we're done with this peace deal, we've come as far as we'd like, we're going back to the military option here. And there is still that risk, frankly. The Taliban, we speak of them as one united group, but it's very clear over the 20 years that they've been fighting this war. Remember, some of these guys were around in the Civil War beforehand, and then possibly even fighting the Soviets before that as well. There's a superannuated generation of Taliban here as well, plus an incredibly young one who've only known war in their lifetime. So there's a huge mix of potential insurgents out there, ranging from hardcore ideological just Taliban to different flavors of extremists through different parts of the ranks to plain moderates as well. So it isn't as though simply the Taliban come in just one flavor, so to speak. There are lots of different brands possibly to keep under the same umbrella here as they move forward through these negotiations. And that's where there could be some fracturing. Although there are some who say, look, it doesn't matter, because if part of the Taliban signs on to the future deal, then that's at least better than where we are now, which is an insurgency gaining ground significantly. So much, frankly, that the usual count you used to get of the US Special Inspector General for Afghanistan's take on how much territory they controlled, we stopped getting those numbers a matter of years back. Critics saying that must simply have been because they weren't very good news for the US presence here. It does seem, though, if they're able to come to the table in some way, that will at least benefit part of slowing down the violence here, which has become extraordinary just here in Kabul in the past months or so, with a remarkable number of IEDs, explosions and assassinations here. What's important to also remember too, though, Lynda, is the Taliban, some say, actually could do with some sort of peace arrangement. Many say, well, if they're doing so well on the battlefield and frankly have the supremacy now that the US are reduced to special forces and air power here, even that reduced when they're talking peace at the peace table, why would the Taliban even need diplomacy? Some say, well, it's because if they feel that they can have a role in government going forwards or properly govern Afghanistan, they will start facing economic challenges, which the current government face now. A country where war, sadly, has become the primary industry. How do they get development aid flooding into the country to keep it, frankly, fed at times, to keep the lights on for ordinary Afghans? They might become the voice of government who people feel the most criticism towards if they fail at the task of governing in whatever possible future hybrid government they may end up being with the current Afghan government or different Afghan elected officials. There are some who say maybe the Taliban could do with the legitimacy of a peace deal, with the legitimacy of seeing other elected officials at the same table as part of any transitional or future government here. So it's a complex task for them, because while they talk very tough militarily, they clearly are winning militarily on the battlefield here. That's sadly been the case for some time. They also possibly see a future, perhaps the elder amongst them, where they see the task of governing as more complicated than simply storming into the major cities and telling everyone to obey their version of Sharia law. So it's going to be a very complex few months ahead, where their position at the negotiating table will most likely fluctuate to some degree, and then they will themselves face a struggle imposing that decision upon the various ranks and various types of fighter and commander they have across Afghanistan here. But frankly, as I had one seasoned observer of Afghanistan say to me recently, everything else has been tried. It's time to try something else. And the one thing that hasn't been tried yet is the Americans actually leaving. And that might possibly be what's required to slow the violence down here and to make the insurgency feel it's less on the outside and possibly more part of running the country to some degree. But it's down to Istanbul, really, and what level of concessions the Taliban are willing to make, what level of concessions the US are expected already to give of themselves, and then whether the Afghan government here, the sort of, not the wild card, bizarre you would say that, but the key functional part here who were left out of initial peace discussions will hopefully be more central in what happens in Istanbul, how they feel about this process, and whether President Ghani, who has been, for a while sort of the poster boy of governance for the West when he first emerged, and has now found himself, like most Afghan presidents in that role, angry, it seems, at an American position which often goes against his own, whether he goes along with the peace process that puts a transitional government, which he most likely won't be part of, ahead of elections, which he would prefer to see first, even though he's accepted he won't necessarily be part of the people on the electoral ballots for that vote. So a complicated few months ahead here, but the simplest thing to take away from this is we now have two presidents, two occupants in the White House in a row, setting a date for the full US departure for America's longest war. And I have to say, I put my money on Joe Biden most likely sticking to his date if he gets the things out of the Taliban he expects to at the negotiating table, simply because his knowledge of this topic far outweighs, you might say, any previous occupant of that particular post. Lynda?
Nick Paton Walsh in Kabul, Afghanistan. Thanks very much to you. Certainly a lot of negotiations to continue over the coming months, but we now have that date. September 11 this year, US troops are set to be withdrawn from Afghanistan, America's longest running war. I'm Lynda Kinkade. Right now we're going to go back to the defense presentation in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin.